The hot summer sun beamed down on the bustling Riverdale Park, its rays glinting off the lush green grass and the brightly colored playground equipment. Families and children filled the space, their laughter and excited shrieks creating a lively atmosphere. In the center of it all stood Karen, a 35-year-old woman with an overinflated sense of self-importance. Karen surveyed the scene, her sharp eyes scanning the area until they landed on a toddler happily playing with a bright red plastic truck. Without a moment's hesitation, she marched over and snatched the toy right out of the child's hands. "Hey, that's mine," the little boy cried, his lower lip trembling as tears welled up in his eyes. Karen sneered, clutching the truck tightly. "Well, I deserve it more than you do. You're just a stupid kid. I'm an adult, and I need this more." The boy's mother, a young woman named Sarah, rushed over, her expression a mix of shock and fury. "Excuse me, what do you think you're doing?" she demanded, her voice sharp and authoritative. "I'm taking this toy," Karen stated matter-of-factly, her beady eyes narrowing as she glared at Sarah. "I need it more than your son does." Sarah's jaw dropped, and for a moment, she was at a loss for words. "That's ridiculous. You can't just take a child's toy. Give it back to him right now." But Karen refused, her grip on the truck tightening as she held it close to her chest. "No, I won't. I deserve it more. I'm an adult, and I have more important things to do with my time than play with toys." The other parents in the area had stopped what they were doing, drawn to the commotion. They began murmuring amongst themselves, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and outrage. Sarah's face flushed with anger, and she took a step closer to Karen, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "That's my son's toy, and you have no right to take it. Give it back to him, right now, or I'll call the police." Karen's eyes widened for a moment, and a flicker of uncertainty crossed her face. But just as quickly, her resolve hardened, and she lifted her chin defiantly. "Go ahead and call the police. I'm not giving this toy back. I deserve it more than your son does." The scene had become a full-blown confrontation, and the other parents were now gathering around, their voices rising in protest. Karen's sense of entitlement had reached a boiling point, and it was clear that this was no longer just about a simple toy. The standoff between Karen and Sarah continued, the tension in the air palpable as the other parents gathered around, their voices raised in outrage. Sarah's son, a toddler named Timmy, stood by her side, his lower lip trembling as he watched his beloved toy being held hostage by the entitled woman. "Give it back to him, right now," Sarah demanded, her voice quivering with a mixture of anger and desperation. "That toy belongs to my son, and you have no right to take it from him." Karen, unfazed by the growing crowd, held the toy close to her chest, a smug expression on her face. "I already told you, I deserve this more than your son does. I'm an adult, and I have important things to do. I don't have time to play with toys." The other parents, their patience wearing thin, began to chime in, their voices creating a chorus of indignation. "That's outrageous." One mother shouted, "You can't just take a child's toy." "Yeah, what kind of grown-up does something like that?" a father added, shaking his head in disbelief. Karen's gaze darted from one person to the next, her expression growing increasingly defensive. "All of you need to mind your own business," she snapped. "This is between me and the child's mother." Sarah, sensing that the situation was spiraling out of control, tried a different tactic. "Please, Karen," she said, her voice softer, more pleading. "Timmy loves that truck, and he'll be heartbroken if you take it from him. He's just a little boy, and he doesn't understand why you're doing this." For a moment, Karen's resolve seemed to waver, and a flicker of uncertainty crossed her face. But then, her expression hardened once more, and she shook her head firmly. "I don't care. I deserve this toy, and I'm not giving it back." The crowd's murmurs grew louder, and a few people began to move closer, their faces twisted with anger. It was clear that Karen's actions had struck a nerve, and the other parents were no longer willing to stand idly by and watch her blatant disregard for a child's property. As the confrontation continued to escalate, it became evident that this was no longer just about a toy. It was about Karen's sense of entitlement, her disregard for the feelings of others, and the consequences that her actions could potentially have. The confrontation between Karen and the other parents had reached a fever pitch, with the crowd's anger and outrage palpable in the air. Sarah, Timmy's mother, stood her ground, her eyes narrowed in determination as she continued to demand that Karen return the toy to her son. Suddenly, a voice rang out from the crowd, cutting through the chaos. "What's going on here?" A deep, authoritative tone asked. All eyes turned to see a police officer making his way through the gathered parents, his brow furrowed in concern. The crowd parted to let him through, and he approached Karen and Sarah, taking in the scene with a critical eye. "This woman took my son's toy and refuses to give it back," Sarah explained, her voice trembling with emotion. "She says she deserves it more than he does." The officer's gaze shifted to Karen, who had the audacity to meet his stare defiantly. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to return the toy to the child," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "No, I won't," Karen spat, her face flushed with anger. "I deserve this toy more than he does. I'm an adult, and I have important things to do. I don't have time to play with toys." The officer's expression darkened, and he took a step closer to Karen. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to come with me. You're causing a disturbance, and your actions are unacceptable." Karen's eyes widened in alarm, and she tightened her grip on the toy. "You can't do this. I haven't done anything wrong. I deserve this toy." But the officer was having none of it. With a firm hand, he reached out and gently pried the toy from Karen's grasp, handing it back to the relieved Timmy. "Ma'am, you're under arrest for theft and creating a public disturbance. I suggest you come quietly, or things will only get worse for you." As the officer cuffed Karen's wrists and began to lead her away, the crowd erupted into cheers and applause. Sarah, tears of relief streaming down her face, gathered Timmy into her arms, the little boy's face lighting up with joy as he hugged his beloved toy. The dramatic turn of events had left Karen's sense of entitlement shattered, and the consequences of her actions were about to become painfully clear. As she was escorted to the police car, the weight of her choices finally began to sink in, leaving her to wonder just how far her entitled behavior would take her. Karen sat in the back of the police car, her wrists cuffed behind her back, the reality of her situation slowly sinking in. She had never imagined that her sense of entitlement would land her in such dire straits, but here she was, headed to the police station to face the consequences of her actions. As the car pulled up to the station, Karen's heart began to race. She had never been arrested before, and the prospect of having a criminal record filled her with a mix of dread and defiance. She knew she had to find a way to get out of this, to prove that she was in the right and that the toy truly belonged to her. Once inside the station, Karen was processed and booked, her fingerprints and mugshot taken. The officers handling her case were unsympathetic, clearly unimpressed by her attempts to justify her behavior. "You can't just take a child's toy, ma'am," one of the officers said, shaking his head in disbelief. "That's theft, pure and simple. You're lucky the mother didn't press charges for assault as well." Karen bristled at the accusation, her eyes narrowing. "But I deserve that toy more than the child did. I'm an adult with important things to do. I don't have time to play with toys." The officer simply stared at her, his expression a mixture of exasperation and pity. "That's not how the law works, ma'am. You can't just take things that don't belong to you, no matter how much you think you deserve them." Karen opened her mouth to argue, but the officer held up a hand, silencing her. "Save it for the judge. You'll have your chance to make your case, but I can tell you right now, it's not going to go well for you." As Karen was led to a holding cell, the reality of her predicament began to truly sink in. She had always been able to get her way in the past, whether through manipulation, intimidation, or sheer force of will. But this time, the rules were different, and the consequences were very real. The weight of her actions bore down on her, and for the first time, Karen began to doubt the validity of her sense of entitlement. As she sat alone in the cell, the sound of the metal bars clanging shut, she couldn't help but wonder if she had gone too far this time. The day of Karen's court appearance arrived, and she strutted into the courtroom with an air of confidence, convinced that she would be able to convince the judge of her rightful claim to the toy. However, as the proceedings began, it quickly became clear that her sense of entitlement would not serve her well in the face of the law. The prosecution laid out the case against Karen, presenting a clear and compelling argument that her actions had constituted theft and disorderly conduct. They detailed the events at the park, highlighting the distress she had caused to the young child and the destruction she had created among the other parents. When it was Karen's turn to speak, she stood before the judge, her chin held high. "Your Honor, I simply must have that toy. I'm an adult with important responsibilities, and I deserve it more than that child did." The judge, a seasoned veteran of the bench, regarded Karen with a stern expression. "Ma'am, the law does not recognize deserving a toy more than a child. You cannot simply take something that does not belong to you, regardless of your perceived needs or status." Karen's eyes narrowed, and she opened her mouth to argue, but the judge raised a hand, silencing her. "Furthermore, your actions caused a significant disturbance and distress to the child and his mother. That is unacceptable behavior, and it will not be tolerated in this court." As the judge continued to outline the charges against her and the potential consequences, Karen's confidence began to waver. She had never anticipated that her sense of entitlement would be so thoroughly dismissed and disregarded in a court of law. The prosecution then called Sarah, the child's mother, to the stand. Her testimony was emotional and heartbreaking, as she described the trauma and fear that her son had experienced at the hands of Karen's actions. The judge listened intently, his expression softening as he heard the pain in Sarah's voice. When it was time for Karen to mount her defense, she found herself at a loss. Her usual tactics of manipulation and intimidation seemed to hold no sway in the courtroom. Faced with the weight of the evidence and the judge's unwavering stance, Karen's sense of entitlement began to crumble. As the judge delivered his verdict, the courtroom held its breath. Karen's fate now rested in his hands, and the consequences of her actions were about to become painfully clear. The courtroom was hushed as the judge rose to deliver his verdict. Karen, her once confident demeanor now tinged with a hint of anxiety, stood before him, her fate hanging in the balance. "The court has carefully considered the evidence presented in this case," the judge began, his voice stern and unwavering. "It is clear to me that the defendant, Karen, engaged in a blatant act of theft, as well as causing a significant public disturbance." Karen's eyes widened, and she opened her mouth to interject, but the judge quickly raised a hand, silencing her. "I will not tolerate any outbursts or attempts to interrupt these proceedings. You will have your chance to speak, but for now, you will listen." Swallowing her words, Karen nodded grudgingly, and the judge continued. The testimony of the child's mother, Sarah, was particularly compelling. The trauma and distress inflicted upon her young son as a result of the defendant's actions is unacceptable and will not be overlooked by this court. The judge paused, his gaze sweeping over the courtroom, making sure that every person present was listening intently. The defendant's claims of deserving the toy more than the child are not only baseless, but also demonstrate a profound lack of empathy and respect for others. This court will not condone such blatant disregard for the rights and well-being of a child. Karen's brow furrowed, and she shifted uncomfortably, her fingers drumming restlessly against the wooden table in front of her. Therefore, the court finds the defendant, Karen, guilty on charges of theft and disorderly conduct. For these offenses, the defendant will be sentenced to 30 days in the county jail, as well as a $500 fine. A collective gasp rang out in the courtroom, and Karen's face contorted with a mixture of shock and outrage. "What? This is an outrage. I'm an adult, and I deserve better than this," she shouted, slamming her fist on the table. The judge's expression hardened, and he fixed Karen with a stern glare. "The court will not tolerate any further outbursts. If you continue to disrupt these proceedings, I will have no choice but to hold you in contempt of court, which will only serve to extend your sentence." Realizing that her usual tactics of intimidation were futile in this setting, Karen begrudgingly fell silent, her shoulders slumped in defeat. The weight of the consequences she now faced had finally begun to sink in, and she couldn't help but wonder how her sense of entitlement had led her down this path. As the bailiff moved to escort Karen from the courtroom, the young mother, Sarah, watched the scene unfold, a mixture of relief and satisfaction on her face. For her, this verdict was not just a victory, but a testament to the power of standing up to those who would seek to undermine the well-being of children. The 30 days Karen spent in the county jail were, without a doubt, the most humbling and eye-opening experience of her life. Gone were the days of expecting special treatment and having her way through sheer force of will. In the confines of the correctional facility, Karen was forced to confront the harsh realities of her actions and the consequences that came with them. At first, she had tried to maintain her air of entitlement, demanding privileges and special accommodations from the guards. But her attempts were met with unwavering resistance and a complete disregard for her perceived importance. The other inmates, too, were unimpressed by her bravado, seeing it for the facade that it was. Slowly, but surely, the walls of Karen's self-righteous bubble began to crumble. She found herself surrounded by individuals from all walks of life, each with their own stories and struggles. Some were there for petty crimes, while others had committed far more serious offenses. But regardless of their circumstances, Karen was forced to confront the harsh reality that her sense of entitlement was not the norm, and that the world did not, in fact, revolve around her. As the days passed, Karen began to reflect on her actions and the choices that had led her to this point. The image of Timmy's tear-stained face and the sound of his heartbroken cries haunted her, a constant reminder of the pain she had caused. She found herself wishing she could go back and undo what she had done, to make amends and regain the respect and dignity she had so carelessly thrown away. In the quiet moments, when the noise of the jail cell faded, Karen would sit on her bunk, staring at the blank walls, and wonder how her life had spiraled so far out of control. Had her sense of entitlement always been this consuming, this destructive? And more importantly, could she ever truly change, or was she doomed to repeat the same patterns of behavior over and over again? As the end of her sentence drew near, Karen began to feel a glimmer of hope. Perhaps during her time in jail, she had finally learned the lesson that had eluded her for so long. But deep down, she knew that the true test would come when she stepped back out into the world, face to face with the same temptations and triggers that had led her down this path in the first place. As the final days of her sentence ticked away, Karen found herself torn between a sense of trepidation and a newfound determination to change. She had emerged from her time in jail a different person, or so she believed. The walls of her entitlement had been chipped away, brick by brick, and she had caught glimpses of a more humble, empathetic version of herself. But the real test would come when she re-entered the outside world, face to face with the same temptations and triggers that had led her down this path in the first place. On the day of her release, Karen stepped out of the jail, blinking in the bright sunlight, a mix of emotions swirling within her. She knew that she had a long road ahead, not just to rebuild her life, but to truly confront and overcome the deep-seated issues that had fueled her sense of entitlement. As she made her way back to her apartment, Karen couldn't help but reflect on the events that had led her here. The image of Timmy's tear-stained face was forever seared into her memory, a constant reminder of the pain she had caused. She vowed to herself that she would never again allow her sense of entitlement to override her empathy and compassion for others. In the days that followed, Karen made a concerted effort to rebuild her life, starting with a sincere apology to Sarah and Timmy. The young mother, surprised by the genuine remorse in Karen's eyes, tentatively accepted the apology, her own sense of anger and resentment slowly giving way to a glimmer of understanding. Karen then sought out counseling, determined to address the root causes of her entitled behavior. It was a difficult and often painful process, as she was forced to confront her own insecurities, fears, and deeply held beliefs. But with each session, she felt a growing sense of self-awareness and a newfound determination to change. Slowly but surely, Karen began to integrate the lessons she had learned in jail into her daily life. She volunteered at a local community center, working with underprivileged children and families, and found a sense of purpose and fulfillment in helping others. The more she gave of herself, the more her sense of entitlement seemed to diminish, replaced by a genuine empathy and appreciation for the struggles of those around her. As the months passed, Karen's transformation became more and more evident to those who knew her. She was still a work in progress, to be sure, but the once entitled and self-absorbed woman had been replaced by a humbler, more compassionate individual, one who was committed to making amends and breaking the cycle of her own destructive behavior. And while the scars of her past actions would likely never fully heal, Karen knew that she had been given a second chance, a chance to prove that she was capable of change, and that even the most deeply rooted flaws could be overcome with dedication, self-reflection, and a genuine desire to be a better person.